this is kind of where the rubber hits the road, because at the end of the day, you can talk in circles about, does God exist? Is he out there? But what we really want to know is, none of that would matter if he's not interested in us. That's what we really care about deep down, isn't it? Beyond the questions of existence, God, if you're there, do you actually want to know me? Are you interested in my life? Are you a God who's going to come close to me, who actually cares enough to respond when I'm reaching out, when I'm praying that agnostic's prayer? And so, what do we do with those feelings of when we're struggling to hear from him, when we are trying to reach out? And I think this is, I even recently we met an atheist. That was his story. He'd been praying as a teenager and felt like that prayer wasn't answered. And that's why he's an atheist today. I think, I have a family member who has that same story, and it's really hard when you feel like the experience isn't lining up with this sort of, you come to a place of sort of intellectually believing it, but you're not feeling it somehow. So what do we do with that? I think the thing, I was reading just this week, actually, I never heard this story before, the story of Helen Keller and her teacher, Anne Sullivan. I don't know if you guys have heard it. I knew of her, but I didn't know how so Helen Keller was deaf and she was blind. And so imagine being in that world as a child where you can't see and you can't hear anything. And so you're in the world, but you're completely unable to interact with it. No one can communicate with you. And so imagine just how dark everything is and how overwhelming, and you have sense and touch, so you kind of, something's out there, it, but you're just fumbling around in the dark, and how lonely and isolated that must have felt. But her parents brought in this woman who would become her teacher, called Anne Sullivan, and so Anne had been with her for 6 months, and the way she was trying to reach out to her was she was writing on her hand letters. She would be drawing letters on her hand to try and get her to have some sense of communication, but it wasn't clicking. Because how did those dots join up for you, right? Just random letters on your hand. How do you start to relate that to the world out there in some sense that you can hear, that you can feel like you're being communicated with, that it's meaningful to you? But then when the penny dropped for her was, so one day she took her hand and she put it under a tap of running water on one hand, and then on the other hand she spelt the word water. And there was something about that experience, it just joined the dots for her, the experience of running water, this physical, tangible something, and then the spelling of the word, and suddenly language came together, and she, for the first time, it clicked, and from there they were able to build this language. She finally came out of the dark and was able to experience the world and be spoken to and be communicated with. And when I heard that story, I just thought, oh my goodness, that's Christianity, right? That's Christianity. As people, we're fumbling around in the dark as human beings. We have this kind of sense, maybe there's a God out there, but he's so far beyond our reach. We cannot get to him. We can't just reach out and make him talk to us. We can't make sense of him. How can we possibly do that? Every other religion, it talks about going up the mountain to meet God or finding your path. But I hear those things, I'm like, that's not going to get you anywhere. How are you going to get to God? He's so much bigger. But the Christian faith says, no, you may feel like God is silent, but God has spoken. God has come to you. God is that living water, that running water over your hand that has come down to you when you're in the dark and nothing is meaningful. And he said, I am here, and I'm gonna speak to you. I'm gonna join up these dots for you so that you can know me, so that you can have me communicate with you. Someone said, Jesus is God spelling himself out in human language so that we can understand. And that's it. That's what it is. That when Jesus came, that was God coming to us. That was God saying, I'm not going to stay silent. I am a speaking God, and I'm going to speak to you. He's the Word made flesh. He's the Word made flesh. And so God has spoken to you. And I think if we can understand that, if we can understand who Jesus is and what it means that he came in history, Vince has just laid that out. He actually came. This is historic. It's verifiable. You can test it. You can find the evidence. But if God came in Jesus, that means God has spoken to you. And so this question then isn't really about, is God speaking to me? Is he silent? It's more about if I'm kind of learning this language to understand God speaking, how do I do that? How do I come to a place where I can actually hear him? Because I have been deaf and blind my whole life, and now I'm learning this language. And Jesus says that, my sheep will know my voice. But that's a process of learning. But God has given us tools to help us. He gave us the Bible. And how powerful is that he knew by ourselves, if we're just going off our feelings, that's so open to manipulation. We'll get so confused. Do I know it's God, or is it just what I want to hear? How do I know? But the Bible is an external resource. It's God's love letter to us, written by so many people, inspired by the Holy Spirit, so that you can know beyond yourself, hey, I may not feel much from God today, but God is speaking to me today. If I want to hear from God, I can literally go and open up his word and he will speak. But more than that, once you come to know Jesus, where you pray that prayer and invite God in, God himself, the Spirit of God, comes to live in you. The same person who inspired the Bible, the same Spirit of Jesus who he gave up on the cross when he breathed out and gave us his Spirit. He's living in you. So you actually have an interpreter. Helen Keller had Anne Sullivan. You have an interpreter, not just, scratching things on your palm, but living within you, to be God communicating with you. So God is committed to speaking to you. God is reaching out to you. And so then when it comes to those personal moments where sometimes in our lives we feel like we're like, God, okay, like maybe you're a God who speaks, but I'm not feeling it right now. I feel like I'm just getting silence. I think we have to hold it in that framework of saying, but God is always speaking to me. The heavens declare the glory of God. Night after night, they're pouring out speech, creation. Even through creation, God is always reaching out. And sometimes it's hard for us to hear because we don't get that immediate yes to whatever question we're asking of him. Whatever we're bringing to him, we may not hear that yes right away. Sometimes it's a wait or it's a not yet, and that's hard to hear. But the question is, do we trust him? And I think when we can look back at Jesus, we know that's a God who's for us. So even in that waiting, we can trust that there's a God who's at work and who's actually saying, maybe there's something, you may not feel it right now, but maybe there's something better about this process of waiting that's going to be more important in your life and more meaningful to who you are becoming and your ultimate destiny than me giving you what you want right away, right now, because you're leaning into me and you're learning to depend on me and you're learning how to hear my voice in this process that we're on. And sometimes it's harder because the answer is no. And that's when it really feels like God is silent. We got miscarriage. I spent 2 weeks after the doctor told us, I believe in a God of life and resurrection. So I prayed for 2 weeks that child would live. So until this child is out of my body, I'm praying for healing. But I still got to know. And it would have been easy to really feel like God was very silent in that moment, to feel like, do you care? You're the God of life. Where's my child? But God was speaking. We drove that restaurant, there was a sign lit up that said Luca. Luca means light, by the way. That's why we chose that name. And then the day that I finally lost my child, that morning I was at work and I didn't know that would be the day, but someone just came and said, I just want to pray for you today. And she knew that I was having a miscarriage, but she didn't know the name of our child. And as she was praying for me, she just said, Jo, God has put a light in you, and that light is never going to stop shining. And in the end, we kind of came to understand you don't always get to know why there's a no. In our case, we got a bit of that because we got to JJ, we got Jonathan. And so, I have that sense of we are a family I'm a mother of 3. I have a child in heaven whose light is never going to stop shining, and we will be together. But even in those times when you don't get to know some of the reason behind the no, we can still look at Jesus and know that God is speaking. In fact, the only person whose prayer was ever met with an existential silence, with a kind of chasm of emptiness and a void, was Jesus. When he prayed on the cross, he prayed, my God, why have you forsaken me? I believe that's the only prayer God actually doesn't answer. And he's met with this empty, gaping chasm of silence. Why? Because when Jesus was on the cross and he died for us, he became sin for us. And so he actually received those consequences of a life where we've distanced ourselves from God, where relationship is broken, where there is no communication. But Jesus didn't have that prayer answered. He was met with silence so that we would literally never have that experience. There is no silence for us because Jesus faced it for us. And so in those moments, we're like, God, where are you? Why aren't you speaking? He has spoken. His word is speaking today. His Holy Spirit is in you and he's speaking. And so I think our prayer is just like, God, help me to understand what feels like silence I know is not actually silence. And so would you keep just being that living water, running across my palm, just speaking to me. Help me to come out of the darkness and learn to hear your voice in a deeper way. Let me be like a sheep who knows the voice of the shepherd.